Assure you that what you will observe is a vast wasteland.
Every day to try and channel it for good.
Deny what they think is false, argument, free and uncorrupted communication.
I'm Alice Slater from New York. I'm with Grace, the Global Resource Action Center for the Environment, and a co-founder of Abolition 2000, the global network working for a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons. And it's my pleasure to moderate this panel today on the consequences of the abandonment of international law. And our first speaker, we are so fortunate to have with us Professor Richard Falk, who's a Professor Emeritus of International Law and Practice at Princeton, and a visiting professor now of Global Studies at the University of California, right here in Santa Barbara. He serves as the chair of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, as a recipient of the UNESCO Peace Education Prize. Professor Falk has provided expert testimony in many high-profile cases in legislative and administrative hearings, and he's authored or co-authored or edited more than 40 books on international law and the law of war. Professor Falk.
Thank you, Alice. And it's a great pleasure to both represent the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and participate in this symposium. I think the quality of what has been said already today justifies the undertaking and challenges those of us that come later. The abandonment of international law, which is the motif of this panel, is in relation to nuclear weapons, of course, nothing new. And it is nothing that we can situate in time. It is it challenges in a very difficult way the enterprise of international law, because it's one of those areas where, over time, since 1945, international law has, in every conceivable, responsible way, established the illegality and criminality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. That is as legally unambiguous, in my judgment, as was the determination that genocide should be viewed as illegal and criminal. And as with the Genocide Convention, if you remember, the opening language reminds us that genocide was illegal before the convention. You didn't need the convention in that sense to establish the illegality and criminality. That it was part of what is called customary international law, and in which the whole law of war is really premised up until the middle of the 20th century on the primacy of customary international law, which governments accepted as the framework for their relations with one another. So the dilemma or the puzzle, in a sense, is where international law is so clear in one direction and sustained by even clearer premises of international morality, yet international politics moves in the opposite direction. that is the situation. What do you do in the face of that divergence? It's not the only context in which this divergence is so vivid and pronounced. It also, in my view, equally characterizes the Israeli-Palestine conflict, where all of the international legal assessments on the critical issues, whether it be the occupation of Palestinian territories or the status of Jerusalem or the settlements or refugees, all of those issues from any perspective relevant to an objective understanding of international law would assess the rights of the Palestinians as having 90 to 95% support from the relevant provisions of international law. And it's because the Palestinians are politically weak and legally strong that the so-called peace process has consistently and deliberately excluded international law from the determination of what constitutes a fair and just peace. In other words, we are living in a world where the primacy of geopolitics is such as to obliterate the relevance of international law in those settings where the political actors who are in a situation to exert this kind of overbearing influence can shape the way in which conflicts are perpetuated or resolved. And I tried to suggest last night that one of the shadows overhanging the nuclear weapons issue is that the atomic bomb was used in a victorious war that was widely and, in my view, correctly appreciated as a just war, and that the apologetics that have been associated with that horrendous acts, which I would say include what we've talked about this morning, the strategic conventional bombing of Japanese cities, that they are both not crimes against humanity. They're not just violations of the laws of war. They're crimes against humanity by any reasonable understanding of the law of war. That because not only was there a suspension of critical scrutiny of the use of atomic weapons, but there was a widely disseminated justification of saving lives, which itself has been criticized. But even if that was true, it doesn't justify what was done, no more than if you gain information by torturing, that makes torture a legitimate practice of state power. The whole premise in that context, too, is that torture constitutes an unconditional prohibition. There are a lot of parts of international law and human rights that are conditional. They're what they call derogation, that in times of emergency, these rights are derogatable. But torture was one that's explicitly in both the relevant international conventions classified as non-derogable. And you can always find some kind of justification, but that's not the point. The that I'm trying to make is, how do we face, with eyes wide open, this gap between the legal and moral imperatives to prohibit and these weapons and achieve nuclear disarmament, and the geopolitical reality that those weapons are embedded in the strategic planning and realities of the major states in the world. And that, I think we've overemphasized the fact that the U.S. is the only bloc to this, to getting rid of nuclear weapons. It was the French president, Chirac, who just recently said that if there was some kind of terrorist incident, France would feel free to use nuclear weapons in response. And what is remarkable about that is that it causes so little dismay, that it is part of the geopolitical discourse. And there's been no pressure from the other nuclear weapon states. The United States would be in a very isolated, uncomfortable position if other nuclear weapon states were advocating disarmament and putting forward proposals. But that hasn't happened. So we have to broaden our understanding of these issues to include the nuclear weapons club and the degree to which it's reinforced by militarist elements of the political culture. David Krieger called our attention this morning to the Indian celebrations in the street after the explosion, the nuclear weapons tests in India back in 1998. And that is something, I guess, that we've helped teach the world, that to have these weapons is a sign of membership in the big club of dominant states. And if you look as people who are interested in international relations and so on have looked at the treatment of India since it became a nuclear weapons power, it's suddenly taken much more seriously. Diplomats visit it, they think about it, it's part of the discussion of the future. The sense that we can somehow convert the illegality of nuclear weapons into a political project is, I think, the most daunting challenge. How do we make that into a meaningful political project? The World Court eloquently and decisively reinforced the notion that these weapons are illegal under almost every conceivable context. And further, they reaffirmed unanimously, including the U.S. judge, that there was a solemn good faith obligation on the part of the nuclear weapons states as a result of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to pursue not arms control, but nuclear disarmament. And there's a decisive difference. So one of the biggest, that I talked last night about the mind game of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, making you think that the real danger is with the states that don't have them rather than the ones that do. But there's a second mind game here, which is to say that if you stabilize nuclear weapons arsenals, you're somehow satisfying the commitment to achieve nuclear disarmament. People made a great fuss about the nuclear freeze movement, which was something in relation to the nuclear arms race. But in a certain way, it normalized rather than moved toward denuclearization in any kind of serious and significant way. And if you look at the treaty obligation, it's not only to get nuclear disarmament, it's to also pursue general and complete disarmament. That is, to attack the roots of the war system, which we were told this morning couldn't be, that the philosophical traditions of the West had shown to be something that one needed to take as part of the inherent human condition. I would question that to some extent. I mean, not only is there a Gandhian counter-tradition, but if we remember, the Christian church before the conversion of Constantine was pacifist. And again, it shows the relationship of faith to power, that St. Augustine was the philosopher of the Roman Emperor Constantine, and was providing a justification for secular power. But putting that aside, I think I don't want to put it altogether aside, because I think the dysfunctionality of war is one of the most important undiscovered realities of our time. If you look at the effort by governments, and especially our own, to solve the problems they confront or the challenges they confront by recourse to war, that has turned out to be a very unsuccessful course of action. And as I said again last night, if we had accepted the discipline of international law, we wouldn't have had the Vietnam War, we wouldn't have had the Iraq War, and of course, looking backwards, we would never have used atomic weapons. And until we can re-educate our societies to understand that power and influence in the 21st century are not correlated with the discretion to violate international law, till we can get that somehow embedded, that it is pragmatic as well as intrinsically beneficial to adhere to this discipline, we will continue to have this gaping chasm separating geopolitical imperatives from legal and moral imperatives, what might be called normative imperatives. And let me end with just this point about the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is not only a diversion from the core issue, it has become the leading pretext for aggressive war, itself a serious crime. And we haven't recognized it sufficiently as a pretext for aggressive war. And beyond that, it's become a way of discriminating between those countries that are allowed to be part of an imperial geopolitics and those countries that will be destroyed because they are seen as standing in the way of this broader project to administer control over the entire global security system. So I think, and let me put this provocatively, I think we have to repudiate the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a basis for seeking a peaceful and just world. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Ambassador Thomas Graham, is chairman of the board of the Cyprus Fund for Peace and Security, a charitable foundation which is established to provide long-term reliable support to selected arms control, nonproliferation, and conflict resolution NGOs. And Thomas Graham served as a senior U.S. diplomat involved in the negotiation of every major international arms control and nonproliferation agreement for the past 35 years. And those of us in the activist movement remember him well in the corridors of power at the UN. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Alice. And once again, I'm happy to be here speaking at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. And Richard, what I'm about to say will to some extent be parallel to what you said in your closing remark, but for different reasons. Can everyone hear me all right? The Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, the NPT, is the centerpiece of world security today. But the success of the NPT was no accident. It was rooted in a carefully crafted central bargain. In exchange for a commitment from the non-nuclear weapon states, today more than 180 nations, most of the world, not to acquire nuclear weapons and to submit to international safeguards to verify compliance with this commitment, the NPT nuclear weapon states pledged unfettered access to peaceful nuclear technologies and undertook to engage in nuclear disarmament negotiations aimed at the ultimate elimination of their nuclear arsenals. It is this basic bargain that for the last 3 decades has formed the central underpinnings of the international nonproliferation regime. However, one of the principal problems with all of this has been that the nuclear weapon states have never really delivered on the disarmament part of this bargain. And the United States, in recent years, appears to have largely abandoned it. The essence of the disarmament commitment was that pending the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons arsenals, the nuclear weapon states would agree to a treaty prohibiting all nuclear weapon tests, would undertake obligations to drastically reduce their nuclear arsenals, and would significantly reduce the role of nuclear weapons in their security policies. None of this has been accomplished over 35 years later. As Mohammed El-Baradei, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, has said, quote, "We must abandon the unworkable notion that it is morally reprehensible for some countries to pursue weapons of mass destruction and acceptable for others to rely on them for security. If the world does not change course, we risk self-destruction." And now the other side of the bargain is beginning to fall apart. There's North Korea, Iran, the illegal AQ-Khan nuclear transfer network, and other issues, cases that we know well. It appears that some countries believe that ultimately the only way that they can gain respect in this world, as President Lula of Brazil declared during his election campaign, is to acquire nuclear weapons, or at least to be seen as able quickly to do so. During the Cold War, nuclear weapons distinguished great powers from other countries. The permanent members of the Security Council are the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states. 40 years ago, Great Britain and France both asserted that status was the real reason that they were building nuclear weapons. This high political value of nuclear weapons has not changed since the Cold War. India asserted in 1998 that it was a big country. It had nuclear weapons. The world significantly lost interest in Ukraine once it gave up the nuclear weapons left on its territory after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The political value of nuclear weapons probably will remain high and may in the end cause the NPT to fail, unless, of course, over time it can be drastically reduced. Likely the only way that this can happen is for nuclear weapons to be delegitimized. This is what was supposed to happen pursuant to the central bargain of the NPT, which increasingly appears unlikely to be realized. In view of all this, it may now simply be too late to attempt to change the course of nations and return to policies which will strengthen and support the NPT and the international non-proliferation regime. In the context of a breakdown of world order and the war on terror, with the potential breakdown of the NPT and the ensuing likelihood of widespread nuclear proliferation that President Kennedy so rightly feared many years ago, an increasing possibility, with nuclear tension a growing threat, with thousands of strategic nuclear weapons still on high alert, and a Russian early warning system continuing to decline in effectiveness, it may be too late for nuclear arms limitation. In the interests of the security and safety of us all, perhaps a way must be found to proceed directly to the elimination of nuclear weapons, as Paul Nitze, in his last op-ed piece, suggested over 6 years ago. A possible course of action could be for the President of the United States to call for an extraordinary session of the United Nations General Assembly and ask to address the Assembly. In his speech, the President could call for the worldwide elimination of nuclear weapons and request that the Security Council be charged to carry out this task. The Security Council could then call for the negotiation of a treaty to eliminate nuclear weapons. This would require worldwide intrusive on-site inspection and probably security guarantees to a number of states, such as Israel, Iran, Pakistan, and North Korea, on the edge of conflicts and where nuclear programs are or may be present. North Korea would return to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. There would need to be an agreement by all states to apply economic and, if necessary, military pressure to any state that did not comply with this program or that subsequently violated the negotiated agreements. In an interim stage, the 5 NPT nuclear weapon states and the 3 other long-time holdouts from the NPT, India, Pakistan, and Israel, would be required to eliminate almost all of their arsenals down to very low levels. A second and later stage would require elimination of weapons, but these 8 states would be allowed to keep a relatively limited amount of nuclear explosive material, highly enriched uranium or plutonium, which could be converted into a small number of nuclear weapons as a hedge. This could amount to roughly enough material for 5 weapons each for India, Pakistan, and Israel, 15 weapons each for Britain, France, and China, and 30 weapons each for the United States and Russia. The material would be maintained under very high levels of national security protection at designated depositories and also be under international safeguards implemented by IAEA inspectors. Under various programs, all other nuclear explosive material would be eliminated worldwide. Such an arrangement would take a long time to negotiate and even longer to implement. but we must try, for the hour is late. A final stage, years in the future, could be the verifiable elimination of the retained fissile material. Some might say that this is unrealistic. How could we ever hope that the United States government would even contemplate such a thing? I would say in response that we must remember it is only governments that can eliminate nuclear weapons, not civil society. So we must press for and hope for the best and remember that nothing good is ever impossible. Who would have thought that the zero missile option proposed by President Reagan in 1981 would ever happen? Who would have thought the Cold War would end in the foreseeable future? Who would have thought that the Soviet Union would cease to exist? But all of these things did happen. But in order to achieve the elimination of nuclear weapons and to establish a peaceful and secure world community in the 21st century, the United States must lead. There is no alternative. But for this to happen, the United States must be believed and trusted. On September 12, 2001, the United States had the trust and support of the entire world. Now, in the wake of exaggerated intelligence claims, rejection of international treaty arrangements, such as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the Ottawa Convention on Landmines, the International Criminal Court, the Kyoto Protocol on Global Warming, and others, an invasion of Iraq opposed by the world community, rejection by some of the rules of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Protocols on the treatment of prisoners of war, and the prison scandals in Iraq and elsewhere, that support and trust is gone, and the United States is reviled and feared in many quarters of the world. Senator John McCain said a few months ago that, quote, America's position in the world is at an all-time low, close quote. How can we regain the trust of the world community? How can we return to our historic destiny of keeping the peace and fostering the development of the community of nations, democracies, free market economies, the international rule of law, international institutions, and treaty arrangements? Among other things, we should, first, end our intervention in Iraq in the best way that is possible and practical. The future of Iraq belongs to the Iraqis. We cannot ensure it for them. Only the Iraqis can build a new Iraq. At an early date, we must firmly and carefully turn over the struggle against the insurgency to the Iraqis, as urged by former Defense Secretary Melvin Laird in his article in an issue of Foreign Affairs a few months ago. Our presence is what feeds the insurgency, he notes, and our steady, gradual, but inexorable withdrawal would strengthen the confidence and ability of the Iraqi security forces to stand up to the insurgency. Second, to recognize that in the wake of the Cold War, the world has fundamentally changed. The nation-state system that has dominated international life for the last 350 years is rapidly deteriorating. Perhaps some 50 to 70 nations around the world are inexorably slipping into the category of failed states. We cannot go it alone. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been roughly one major nation-building intervention every 2 years. Poverty, disease, cultural misunderstandings, and machine gun societies around the world are central national security threats. These are the principal causes of international terrorism and the primary weapons in the battle against terror and declining world order are economic, political, social, cultural, and diplomatic, and only rarely military. Reconstruction and failed states is one thing, it is relatively well understood. But in many cases, development, of necessity involving institution building, is essential to return failed states to a level where they can function. But to quote the well-known historian Francis Fukuyama, quote, any honest appraisal of where the state of the art lies in development today would have to conclude that although institutions may be important, we know relatively little about how to create them, close quote. But one thing that we do know is, quote, coalitions in the form of support from a wide range of other countries and international organizations are important for a number of reasons. And third, for over 50 years, the United States pursued a world order built on rules and international treaties that permitted the expansion of democracy and the enlargement of international security. Earlier this year, in a speech before the American Society of International Law, the Secretary of State said that when the United States respects its, quote, international legal obligations and supports an international system based on the rule of law, we do the work of making this world a better place, but also a safe and more secure place for America, close quote. We should take such steps as ratifying the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, joining the Ottawa Landmine Convention, becoming a part of the International Criminal Court, and establishing ourselves again as strong advocates of the international rule of law. In this way, we can regain our historic role, and we can and we will effectively lead the world community to a safe, secure, stable, and just 21st century. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Asla Bali, is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Politics at Princeton University, and she'll be talking about her dissertation, which focuses on the inconsistent enforcement of international legal norms and the consequences of such inconsistency. And she has also earned her JD from the law school at Yale and is an attorney in private practice in New York. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm sure it hasn't escaped your attention that I'm distinct from the other speakers on the panel today in a number of ways. Obviously, age and gender probably jump out at you, but a third one, which you will now have understood from my bio, is prestige. So I'm going to try to make up for these gaps on such a prestigious panel by focusing on a much narrower question than the remainder of the panelists have taken up. Specifically, I'm interested in the case of Iran, and in fact, I'm not going to talk to you about my dissertation. You can all breathe a sigh of relief. Nothing very general about international law and its inconsistent enforcement is going to be presented. Instead, I want to look very narrowly at the Iranian question and challenge the claim that was made at one point earlier today that we all know very well what's going on with Iran and the AQ Khan network and North Korea and others. I think, in fact, tragically, we don't know nearly enough about what's happening in Iran, and the way it's being portrayed in the Western media generally, and the United States in particular, is extremely misleading in ways that I think enables this administration to basically pull the blinds over people's eyes and encourage us to believe that there's an inescapable conflict here and that Iran represents a serious threat. I think that these things need to be drawn into question, and I think that a close examination of the course of the Iranian negotiations over the last 2 to 3 years would enable that particular problematization of the way in which it's characterized to us generally by the administration and in the press. So let me just start by saying that the main way that we think about the NPT as having a problem today, and many of the speakers have drawn attention to this, is not in the failure to meet disarmament goals by the nuclear weapon states. In fact, many commentators, at least from my background and particularly in the politics department in my university, consider it to be laughable that there was ever any conception that disarmament would meaningfully be accomplished. And this was not the actual bargain at the core of the NPT, but rather that non-nuclear weapon states agreed to forego weapons essentially to stabilize the international system, to have access to civilian nuclear energy, and in order to basically be in good relations and have good standing in the international order at the time that this agreement was concluded. So then where does the dilemma lie? The dilemma lies in the fact that from that period to today, there has come to be an understanding that there is what's known as a dual-use dilemma, namely that as non-nuclear weapon states acquire the civilian technology necessary to develop nuclear energy, so they also acquire the capability to have at least a latent nuclear weapons ability. And the reason for this is because the technology related to the enrichment of uranium for nuclear energy purposes and fuel purposes is very similar to the technology necessary for the enrichment of uranium to highly enriched levels for the use in nuclear weapons to develop fissile materials. So this is seen as a major loophole in the non-proliferation treaty regime by the nuclear weapon states that are concerned that countries that try to pursue a civilian energy program indeed will also have the necessary capacity to develop a weapons program. There are about 40 countries that now have civilian energy programs in the world that are not nuclear weapon states. And as you know, Iran has been singled out among these as a country of serious concern should it be able to develop a weapons capacity, and that's of course because of the region and because of the nature of the domestic regime type. But there isn't, and I can start with this, there isn't a distinction in terms of the NPT's logic of Iran as against any other country that's a non-nuclear weapon state seeking this kind of energy. Now, the backdrop against which we also need to think about the Iranian case, first, as I say, is this dual-use dilemma, and second is what we can anticipate will be the energy needs of the developing world in the next century. Clearly, energy needs are going to accelerate most greatly in the developing world where industrialization is still being undertaken at a very accelerated rate. And we also know that the fossil fuel energy resource is one that's going to be increasingly prohibitively expensive, particularly for developing countries. What does this mean? This means that the developing world is going to be pursuing alternative energy sources, and one of the most available and cheapest for many developing countries will be nuclear energy. So we can foresee a world in which an increasing number of developing countries that are non-nuclear weapon states will be pursuing the ability to have civilian nuclear energy. And so then how does the Iranian case look from the world's perspective? From the perspective of the nuclear weapon states, it looks like a case of a difficult state of concern and a problematic and at times a regime that's seen as irrational, pursuing an energy capacity that may give them a weapons capacity and therefore a threat. From the rest of the world's perspective, and particularly from the perspective of non-nuclear weapon states that are developing countries, this looks like a case in which a country that has agreed to forego its right to nuclear weapons and is participating in the NPT regime is being prevented from pursuing its right to a civilian nuclear energy program in a way that will might set a precedent and compromise the rest of the developing world's ability to access that energy. That, I think, is the critical perspective that needs to be understood here in comprehending the political course and the danger that the Iranian case poses to the NPT. The real danger is not what will Iran do. The real danger is what will the Iranian precedent do to the willingness of other states that may have no weapons, may have no pursuit of weapons in their policy planning, willingness to remain in the NPT. And I think what it's going to do is critically damage the willingness of non-nuclear weapon states to remain in a regime that may ultimately be manipulated from their perspective to deny them access to energy resources that they need in the coming century. So having said that, what are the keys to the Iranian dilemma? And by the way, let me just step back and say, as far as I'm concerned, the impasse that we have now reached between Iran and the IAEA board and soon to be the Security Council is entirely avoidable. And I'm going to get at the end, and I hope that people have had access to my paper. It's impossible for me to try to summarize the course of these negotiations here because between Iran and the European Union, Iran and Russia, Iran and other actors, because it's just a complicated story rendered more complicated by the fact that it's so inaccurately reported in the press that I would have to first get you to come on a long journey with me to undo what you've heard about the Iranian case and then turn to the story of what's actually happened. But instead of doing that, I want to step back and think of it in a more abstract way. So I think it's an avoidable impasse, and I think the two keys to understanding how we've come to the obstacle in this course are first, understanding Iran's own threat perception, and secondly, understanding the civilian energy needs, as I've described them, of the rest of the world and how this case can play out. So let's start with the threat perception. And here I'm going to just turn to the problematic context that's established by United States policy in enhancing Iran and other countries' incentives to acquire nuclear weapons as a result of their quite rational perception of the threats that they face. First, the American government, as we've heard already several times today, and I'm just going to go through these quite quickly, has a first-use policy. That is to say that it is willing to use nuclear weapons when it has not itself suffered a nuclear weapons strike. Secondly, the United States has suspended under Bill Clinton in 1997 and continuing under Bush its 1978 pledge not to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states. So not only do we have a first-use policy, but we might engage in a first-use against a non-nuclear weapon state. Third, we have engaged very successfully, unfortunately, in a geostrategic policy as the United States of encirclement of Iran. So at this point, Iran lives in a region in which the United States flanks it in Iraq with forces in Iraq, in Afghanistan with forces in Afghanistan, in the Persian Gulf waters with forces stationed there, in Turkey with its Incirlik air base and all of the NATO arsenal that comes with it, in the Central Asian republics with military bases that have been established there, and with Israel to its south. So indeed, Iran is encircled by nuclear weapons, and nuclear weapons that are in a bloc allied with the United States. Fourth, U.S. investment in new nuclear weapons. This has been gone through. Jackie did a great job in the previous panel of discussing this, so I won't go into the details, but the modernization of the U.S. arsenal, it suggests, again, that there is a credible threat of use on the part of the United States and therefore heightens the threat perception of countries that believe that they may be targets. Fifth, the reversal of disarmament commitments, particularly the development of a missile defense system. This, again, is a major threat to Iran because Iran's entire conventional capacity relies on the use of missiles. So the idea that a functional missile defense system, however outlandish it may seem sitting here in the United States that we're ever going to get to that point, but investment in that and the possibility that it would be extended to countries like Israel, for example, would incapacitate Iran's conventional strike abilities and thereby increases its threat perception, increases the belief that it is facing a proliferation world, that missile defense is itself a form of proliferation, and forces it to look to non-conventional sources for its own defense. Sixth, the role in blocking progress at the 2005 NPT review that the United States occupied. In other words, the 2005 NPT review, and again, this has been discussed in some other papers, so I'm not going to go into it in detail, but there was a total failure to make any progress towards non-proliferation goals or disarmament goals at the 2005 review conference, and this was generated in part by basically a tug of war, let's call it, between Iran and the United States and also other non-aligned movement countries as to what the priority should be, whether the priority should be the nuclear weapon states' obligations or the obligations of the non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT. But this signals that the NPT regime framework is itself eroding. And indeed, I think that's an accurate assessment. And in that circumstance, once again, the threat perception of non-nuclear weapon states is aggravated by the view that there's not going to be a regime to control the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The United States' unwillingness to support a Middle East that is a weapons of mass destruction free zone, which is a euphemistic way of saying the United States' unwillingness to put any pressure on Israel to observe disarmament obligations or enter into the non-proliferation treaty, is another major problem from Iran's perspective. And finally, I'm going to just focus on this part in order to move us to where we are in terms of the EU negotiations. The consistent efforts by the United States to block Iranian access to open market sources, both for their civilian energy needs and for totally different purposes, for example, pharmaceutical needs and other needs. The United States has engaged in secondary sanctions. First of all, primary sanctions on Iran, so you can't engage in trade with Iran if you're an American corporation, but secondly, secondary sanctions, which penalize other companies and other entities in the international system for engaging in trade with Iran in areas that the United States deems to be of importance because such materials, for example, may have a dual-use capability. What this has meant, Iran argues, is that they have been unable, through usual channels, to engage in the development of their industries domestically. And moreover, they argue that the non-proliferation treaty regime's entire framework, if we remove the disarmament component and just look at the rest of the bargain, is precisely that non-nuclear weapon states are supposed to have facilitated access to being able to get these technologies, and yet the Iranian government, which is a participant in the NPT, is systematically blocked. This enables Iran to make the argument that they had to go to black market sources in order to develop their industrial base, that they had no alternative because they were systematically blocked to access by the U.S. Now, put this beside the fact that the United States is engaging in a civilian energy cooperation agreement with India, a country that has acquired nuclear weapons, has refused to participate in the NPT, and you have a picture in which you can understand how Iran's threat perception is being informed by U.S. policy. Now, given all of this backdrop, what happened with these negotiations between Iran and the EU? Is it fair to say that Iran withdrew from its discussions with the European Union and engaged in a series of unilateral actions to escalate its conflict with the IAEA? Well, to begin with, what would Iran need against the picture that I just portrayed in order to forego its civilian nuclear energy program? First, it would need guaranteed access to nuclear fuel supply. It is argued that it's been cut off, and it's true that it has been cut off from nuclear fuel supply dozens of times. This is its argument for needing to develop its own fuel supply, that when it goes out on open market and tries to buy nuclear fuel, or even when in fact it makes an equity investment in a reactor elsewhere that's producing enriched uranium, as with its billion-dollar investment in Eurodif in France, it nonetheless, the money is hijacked, they're not given their nuclear fuel, and essentially they feel that they're wronged both from an international commercial perspective and in terms of their rights under the NPT. So it needs to have a guaranteed fuel supply. It needs to have security guarantees. Why? Because it believes that it needs to pursue a nuclear energy capacity as a virtual deterrent, as a deterrent to those countries that might engage in a kind of invasion that Iraq, its neighbors, suffered, precisely because they think that Iran can't defend itself. So it wants to develop a deterrent capacity, at least a virtual deterrent capacity, and in order to incentivize it to forego that capacity, one would need to extend security guarantees. Now, what has happened with the EU negotiations? Well, to begin with, the United States government apparently refused Iranian overtures to engage in direct bilateral negotiations in 2002. I think that's a fatal error on the part of the United States. Secondly, the United States refused to back the European Union's original initiative, which was to say that we will engage in negotiations with Iran to permit it to have limited enrichment subject to objective guarantees of non-diversion of their enrichment to weapons purposes, in exchange for Iran agreeing to compromise on the breadth of its program and remain within the NPT regime and its additional protocol enhanced inspections. Because the U.S. failed to back that, the Europeans were in no position to provide a security guarantee. No country or group of countries on earth can provide any country with a security guarantee if the United States doesn't participate and the United States views that country as a potential target, because there is no country that can defend any country on earth from a strike by the United States. And as a result, no plausible security guarantee could be provided by the Europeans to Iran. Moreover, the Europeans changed their negotiating stance as a result of their discussions with the United States, and they took the position, and this is important because Iran's participation in these negotiations was premised on the idea that it was possible to conceive of objective guarantees of its non-use, non-diversion of its nuclear materials to military purposes that were short of forcing it to completely cease its enrichment activities. So Iran was led to believe in the negotiations that it could enter in and come up with some formula whereby it would be permitted some limited enrichment capacity research in exchange for participating in a very intrusive inspections regime. This position was changed by the Europeans in 2005. I detail, in the paper how this happened, but basically they took the position that there can be no objective guarantee short of Iran stopping its entire program. Iran would probably never have come to the table if it believed that that was going to be the ultimate position the Europeans took, because the negotiations failed. So that is basically the core of what happened in the negotiations. So what then are the current alternatives? Obviously, the UN Security Council is about to receive a report about the Iranian nuclear program from the IAEA in March, and that is the alternative which is currently on the table, which is a confrontational alternative, and that suggests that coercion might be used in order to force Iran to desist from its current course. I think that this is an incredibly dangerous approach and one that has almost no prospect of success. I go through the details of this in the paper, but one of the main cornerstones is, as far as I'm concerned, there is no military solution to the Iranian program. Neither can the United States engage in airstrikes, and I mean, this actually connects to a presentation we heard earlier this morning. The idea that you can rely on air power to meet political objectives is misguided to begin with, but in the Iranian case, it's extremely misguided. It would lead to, according to one Oxford report, potentially tens of thousands of deaths. It would not adequately deprive Iran of the capacity to pursue this program, but it would certainly accelerate the incentives of the Iranian people and of its government under any regime to pursue a nuclear weapons option if they were struck with weapons by a nuclear weapons state. So I think this is a terrible option, and I would love it if we did have enough time for questions in this session, if we could talk about this more and that people would have access to the paper to go through why. So what then, if there is no good coercive approach, what are the alternatives? In my mind, the best alternative at the moment that's on the table is a combination of the series of alternatives I go through in the paper. First, Russia has proposed to engage in a joint venture with Iran to develop an enrichment facility on Russian soil that would supply Iran with a nuclear fuel supply guarantee. Now, this is a little problematic from an Iranian perspective because Iran had such a joint venture, or at least had made an equity investment in such a venture in France, and as I've noted in my previous remarks, was nevertheless blocked from the nuclear fuel supply in a facility that it had made a 10% investment in. Nonetheless, given Iranian-Russian relations at the moment, there's reason to believe that Iran might be able to overcome its skepticism about the nature of this fuel supply guarantee, should it be permitted in conjunction with the Russian proposal, a very limited enrichment capacity domestically, a research enrichment capacity, that would be subject to an extremely heightened, intrusive inspections regime to which the Iranians had already agreed in March 2005, namely on-site personnel of the IAEA at any facility, 24 hours a day, monitoring everything that takes place at the facility. To combine these, I think the stronger inspections regime has the added benefit of not only retaining Iran in the NPT, but setting a precedent for strengthening inspections in general for all countries that seek, all non-nuclear weapon state countries that seek to develop a domestic nuclear fuel cycle. And as I said, for reasons of energy needs that we can anticipate in the next century, I think there's going to be a greater and greater number of these countries, and there's going to be greater trade in fissile materials internationally in general, and the idea that we would have no adequate inspections regime to deal with this accelerated trade is a very frightening one, I think, given the scenarios of these kinds of materials falling into non-state hands. And so having this precedent of a really heightened inspections regime, I think, would do a great deal to strengthen the NPT instead of weakening it, as Security Council action might do. And then finally, I think that this is a good opportunity to think about regionalizing fuel cycles. And I'm sorry if this seems like a kind of technical presentation. You know, I'm assuming a lot of knowledge about how the nuclear fuel cycle connects to non-proliferation concerns. But basically, one suggestion that has been put on the table by numerous parties, including the IAEA, is to take a perspective on the fuel cycle, understand that it's unacceptable for most non-nuclear weapon states to reify nuclear apartheid as they see it, the continuation of a have and have-nots arrangement regime, even with respect to the fuel cycle. So we already have that for weapons. There are countries that are allowed to retain their weapons. There are countries that are never permitted to gain weapons. Now there are proposals that we should have the same thing with the nuclear fuel cycle. In particular, the Bush administration has proposed this, that countries that currently have nuclear fuel production capacities retain it, countries that don't have it be precluded from ever getting it. That would be extremely unacceptable, and that would pretty much put an end to the NPT regime from the perspective of most of the developing world, I think, because they would not be prepared to accede to further restrictions on their rights in exchange for nothing from the nuclear weapon states. In contrast, the idea of having a regional nuclear fuel cycle, having regional groups develop an enrichment capacity and production capacity might be a fruitful alternative to think through. And for the Middle East in particular, this would be an important possibility for getting past the impasse that we're currently at with the Israeli nuclear program on the one hand, and Iran's quite rational threat perceptions driving incentives for an Iranian latent capacity on the other. So thank you very much.
And now I'm very pleased to introduce the Honorable Douglas Roach. Doug is an author, parliamentarian, and diplomat. I've had the privilege of working with him on his Middle Powers initiative that he has organized, inspired, and championed to get the middle powers on this planet to put some pressure on the nuclear weapon states. Doug is an author. He's written many books. In 1995, Pope John Paul presented him with the Papal Medal for his service as Special Advisor on Disarmament and Security Matters, and he was a member of the Canadian Senate. His list is too long to read here, but he's just a wonderful person to have. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Alice. Ladies and gentlemen, the nuclear disarmament movement must focus on driving home to the public and politicians a clear core message. Nuclear weapons are immoral and illegal. They are a crime against humanity. Though often treated separately, the moral and legal arguments have a common basis in humanity's long understanding that indiscriminate destruction of life violates the humanitarian value of life itself. Two of the towering figures in the nuclear disarmament movement, the late Sir Joseph Rotblat and Judge Christopher Weirmantry have forcefully expressed the interrelatedness of the twofold message. We ought to concentrate on what they have taught us as we ourselves here at this conference explore ways to demand effectively that governments live up to their moral and legal responsibilities. Rotblat provided an example of how to express the anti-human nature of nuclear weapons in moral language that transcends religions. Only a few months before his death, last August, he sent to the 2005 Review Conference of the Non-Proliferation Treaty a message that said this: "Morality is at the core of the nuclear issue. Are we going to base our world on a culture of peace or on a culture of violence? Nuclear weapons are fundamentally immoral. Their action is indiscriminate, affecting civilians as well as military, innocents and aggressors alike, killing people alive now and generations as yet unborn. And the consequence of their use might be to bring the human race to an end. All this makes nuclear weapons," he said, "unacceptable instruments for maintaining peace in the world." Rotblat then sealed his argument. He said, "How can we talk about a culture of peace if that peace is predicated on the existence of weapons of mass destruction? How can we persuade the young generation to cast aside the culture of violence when they know that it is on the threat of extreme violence that we rely for security?" This language crosses all boundaries and becomes inextricably interwoven with the processes of daily life. The language can resonate with politicians who need to be able to relate to all segments of their constituencies. Nuclear weapons and human security cannot coexist on the planet. Nuclear weapons are anti-human. This is what the moral aspect of the discussion is all about. Humanitarian law has always recognized that limitation and proportionality must be respected in warfare. But the very point of a nuclear weapon is to kill massively. The killing and the poisonous radiation cannot be contained. The social and economic consequences of nuclear war in a world whose life support systems are intimately interconnected would be catastrophic. The severe physical damage from blast, fire, and radiation would be followed by the collapse of food production and distribution and even water supplies. The prospect of widespread starvation would confront huge masses of people. Rampant disease would follow the breakdown in healthcare facilities. These immense brutalities would violate the universal norm of life, to go on living in a manner befitting a human being with the inherent right to life. No civilization, no culture has ever denied this common foundation upon which all people stand. Leaving aside the massive suffering, which by itself ought to stir the consciences of the nuclear proponents, the entire question of human rights would be upended. The right to a social and international order, as set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, would be completely lost. The structures underpinning humanitarian law would be gone. Order would be inverted into disorder. What is the self that the proponents of nuclear use for self-defense supposed to mean? The only way to really uncover the hypocritical defense of nuclear weapons as instruments of self-defense is to focus on the overarching humanitarian question. It is empowering to note that the age of weapons of mass destruction arrived just at the time when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and its follow-up instruments were being codified. Just when we have learned that every human, no matter the culture, religion, ideology, or geography, has the right to life, we have perfected our ability to kill massively. The UN's formulation of a culture of peace is leading us inevitably to the recognition that every human being has the right to peace. In fact, as is said in the early declarations on this subject, to the sacred right to peace. The gradual increase in humanity's understanding of itself will lead to a societal condemnation of nuclear weapons when it is fully understood that such instruments are evil and a violation of life itself. The innate understanding of human rights has also been shown by Judge Wehrmantry, who was Vice President of the International Court of Justice when it issued its advisory opinion on the legality of nuclear weapons in 1996. His 88-page document accompanying that opinion deals convincingly with every last argument advanced by the nuclear weapon states in support of their position, including deterrence, reprisals, internal wars, the doctrine of necessity, the health hazards of all, and also including the so-called mini-nuclear weapons. Then Judge Wehrmantry stated this: "My considered opinion is that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is illegal in any circumstances whatsoever. It violates the fundamental principles of international law and represents the very negation of the humanitarian concerns which underline the structure of humanitarian law. It offends conventional law, and in particular, the Geneva Gas Protocol of 1925 and Article 23A of the Hague Regulation of 1907. It contradicts the fundamental principles of the dignity and worth of the human person on which all law depends. It endangers the human environment in a manner which threatens the entirety of life on the planet." That from Judge Wehrmantry. Now, while regretting that the court did not hold that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is unlawful in all circumstances without exception, Judge Wehrmantry said that the court's opinion does take the law far on the road towards total prohibition. The effect of the World Court advisory opinion is to provide, for the first time, a legal basis for political action to ban nuclear weapons. At first, the effect might seem minimal, because nuclear states are ignoring it, NATO is hostile to it, and the media have generally marginalized it. But the opinion is a watershed, because it has made a strong statement of the law governing the threat or use of nuclear weapons. It effectively delegitimized nuclear deterrence. At the very least, nuclear proponents can no longer claim that nuclear weapons are a legitimate tool of warfare. The court forcefully identified the elimination of nuclear weapons as the true solution to the risk of planetary catastrophe posed by the existence of nuclear weapons. It is the highest level legal push ever given to governments to get on with nuclear disarmament. It goes beyond the NPT's Article 6, which obliges nations merely to pursue negotiations on nuclear disarmament. The court has deemed that such negotiations must be concluded. Moreover, it explicitly separated the two themes of Article 6, nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. No longer can the nuclear powers credibly state that nuclear disarmament can only come in the context of general disarmament. The ultimate evil must be eliminated urgently. By emphasizing that nuclear weapons are not exempt from the rules of humanitarian law, the court, even though it divided on the application of certain questions of law, has brought nuclear weapons into the legal arena. It threw a spotlight on the laws of humanity and the dictates of the public conscience. Since leaving the court, Judge Werematry has maintained his ardent stance on the illegality of nuclear weapons. And in 2003, he told a seminar, "Nuclear weapons are illegal under international law because the usages established among civilized peoples, the laws of humanity, and the dictates of the public conscience of the global community would all undeniably unite in condemning this monstrosity which can obliterate entire cities, destroy the environment, and even extinguish all the culture and civilization built up by centuries of human efforts in one fell stroke." He said, "Can there be any doubt that all civilization, all humanitarian sentiment, all dictates of the public conscience would reject out of hand even the semblance of a contention that such a weapon could be brought within the bound of legality?" Now, interpreting the law on this matter is a complex process if one takes the view that any means of self-defense is valid. The nuclear proponents have, of course, taken this route. The search for security through technology led to the nuclear arms race, and the public everywhere was told that this was necessary for self-defense. Our common humanity was denied, as if the moral problems of the obliteration of whole sections of humanity could be swept aside by technology. In secular cultures, the maintenance of nuclear weapons has been rationalized away. No law expressly forbids the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and the absence of such a law enables the nuclear proponents to drive onward. The World Court felt that it could not by itself invent, so to speak, a new law, but it clearly pointed the way to the political development of such a law which would be built on a common understanding that humanitarian law does not permit mass killing. I come now to the conclusion and the point that I hope the sponsors of this conference will note. Humanitarian law must be applied to every use of nuclear weapons. A return to humanitarian law, not technological refinements of the act of killing, is required for society to deal with the illegality of nuclear weapons. A nuclear weapons convention prohibiting the production as well as the use of all nuclear weapons in all circumstances is urgently needed. Lawmakers, that is to say politicians and government officials, must be awakened by public demand to pass such legislation. An ironclad law prohibiting all nuclear weapons must be made. This will happen only when the evil nature of nuclear weapons is recognized rather than being denied as it is today. By emphasizing our humanity, not our technological prowess, we can achieve a universal law criminalizing the production and use of all nuclear weapons. Thank you.
And the question briefly is, Ambassador Graham, do you have any insight into why the speech at the United Nations asking for the elimination of nuclear weapons wasn't made in 1995 at the NPT Review and Extension Conference?
Well, Jackie, I would just answer that question by saying I just don't think the government was there at that time. I mean, such a decision had not been discussed, such a proposal had not been discussed, and it was difficult enough to get the test ban through the government, even the Clinton government. We signed on to the Statement of Principles, which is a condition to the indefinite extension of the NPT, which called for a CTBT in 1996. And as soon as we had done that, there was backsliding at defense saying that we should have a 500 kiloton threshold and so forth, and we had to fight that for a good part of the next year. The government just wasn't there, and of course international terrorism had not accelerated to the point where it is now. And I think the case for elimination is so much stronger now because it's so obvious that in the world in which we live today, nuclear weapons not only don't add to our security, they probably, I shouldn't say probably, they do derogate from our security because of the general decline in world order and the increasing power of our international terrorist opposition.
How can we get the information out about what Iran is really up to that you presented in your material, Asla?
Thank you. I also have a response to the earlier comment that I'll start with, which is this claim that we need to focus on the danger of nuclear terrorism, I think, is I find it problematic for the reason that, first of all, Richard Falk pointed to, which is this fallacy of focusing on actors that don't have nuclear weapons instead of focusing on actors that do. And I think that I mean, the idea that the nuclear arsenal that the United States has is somehow less of a concern or something that we shouldn't be focusing on, but the potential arsenal that Al-Qaeda in some future scenario might acquire is the real thing that we should focus on, I think is just a terribly dangerous diversion from what's in fact happening in the global arena, in part for the reasons I just indicated. It's the threat perception of non-nuclear weapon states that drives their incentive to acquire nuclear weapons. Similarly, the Al-Qaeda estimate that 4 million Muslims may have been killed directly or indirectly by U.S. actions is probably quite correct. And if it is correct, they're not the only ones with an eye for an eye approach. The United States also takes an eye for an eye approach. In fact, one American eye is often worth millions of other people's eyes. So under this scenario, I think that what we need to really attend to is the nature of American policy and behavior that incentivizes others in these ways. And then I would get to a whole other question, which is, are these actors deterrable? I take issue with David Krieger's claim that they are not deterrable or that they're irrational. I think it's really problematic that when we come to enemies or adversaries, we suddenly abandon the very theories that justify our own actions as rational or deterrable and so forth, and adopt a completely wholly different strategic way of thinking and policy framework in trying to conceptualize their motivations. I think that, in fact, Al-Qaeda has demonstrated that it's immensely deterrable when its actions resulted in massive casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq. They revised their strategies. Now they're calling for truces. They're engaging in media propaganda strategies and so forth. I think that there's every reason to believe they are deterrable precisely because the United States does not adopt the position that David Krieger has suggested, which is to say there would be no potential target to strike should Al-Qaeda do something, and therefore they're undeterrable. Actually, the United States takes rather the position that's proposed by your thing, but in reverse, namely that all of the Muslim world is a legitimate target should one actor, one extremist actor acting on behalf of one organization engage in any kind of strike. And that's why we're seeing the kind of East versus West civilizational conflict and so forth unfolding today is much more because of the incentives that have been put into place by American policy than any action by Al-Qaeda. So that to the first point. To the second point, I think that one of the reasons that it's so difficult to get this out, and I'm not going to give you a magic bullet or whatever, because there is no easy answer to this, is the complicity not only of the media but also of academics in America to viewing themselves as engaged in some kind of a patriotic effort to advance policies or theories or frameworks which are consonant with American defense policy of the particular moment. And therefore, this incredibly gullible and strange world in which we simply accept as evidence information that is relayed as propaganda by our government. And this, of course, and I mean a very recent and clear example of this is the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq argument. Very few people seriously questioned that conclusion on the part of, because it was reiterated so many times and so forcefully, it was just believed that this is the state of Western intelligence. I mean, I think it's questionable that that was the state of Western intelligence. Moreover, I think that there's a very dangerous, vicious circle whereby these kinds of claims are made, academics pick them up, it's picked up in the media, it circulates, and it just becomes conventional wisdom to the point that potentially intelligence agencies themselves are persuaded by what was originally a kind of propagandistic justificatory framework for a set of policies that people were interested in pursuing. So what we need to get at is that complicity, that structure that enables information to be used obviously information is power, we all know that, but information is being manipulated and used in particular ways, and it's not only by government actors, and I'm not speaking as a conspiracy theorist, I just think our motivations are very problematic. Where do our universities get their funding? What happens to journalists in terms of their access to information and powerful policymakers when they report on unpopular facts, and so forth? There's a broader structure here that we would need to get at for my kind of voice to ever be heard. Right now, all I get is penalties at my university for saying things in my dissertation that nobody likes to hear.
Tom, you had a follow-up.
I want to express intense disagreement with some of the remarks that Asli just made. Focusing on nuclear terrorism is not a diversion. It is the #1 threat to every person on this planet, and not just people in the United States, but people in Europe, people in Asia. And it's a very, very dangerous threat, and one we should take very seriously. And there's a reasonable likelihood, as Bill Perry has said, that there could be a major nuclear incident within the next decade. He was focusing on the United States, but doesn't have to happen here. It could happen in Russia, it could happen in Europe, it could happen in Japan. Who can say? It is the #1 threat, and it's not a diversion to focus on it. And second, in my opinion, it is not the U.S. position that the entire Muslim world is fair game if a terrorist act occurs. Who knows what the situation would be? It would depend on the terrorist attack, but certainly after 9/11, I don't think it's fair to say that it was, whatever one's view is of this government, that the entire Muslim world automatically became fair game for United States attack.
Do you want to respond? Yeah.
I would just very quickly respond to that by saying I'm not suggesting that nuclear terrorism is not a threat. I'm suggesting that it's diversionary to claim that this is where our focus has to be above all other things. And secondly, I would add that I think for much of the world, the #1 priority and danger is the first use doctrine of nuclear weapon states. And more specifically, I would say that Iran today represents a tremendous danger and is a priority for much of the world because there's a real possibility of provoking a nuclear confrontation in the Middle East as a result of United States coercive policy and not as a result of, as I try to suggest in the paper, escalation on the part of Iran. It's going to be very hard to untangle that empirical record after the fact should this happen. I happen to believe it's not going to happen because I hope that there are better checks and balances in the Pentagon today against that kind of an irresponsible act than there may have been 2 or 3 years ago before the Iraq War. But I think it would be terribly devastating to international security, and it's a much more realistic and near-term threat than the hypothesis that terrorists might get their hands on nuclear weapons. I'm not discounting that hypothesis or suggesting it's not empirically real. I'm just suggesting that that's not, especially sitting in America, sitting in a conference talking about nuclear age in this country, I think it's not meaningful to say that our first priority should be worrying about actors outside of our borders and their attempts to acquire weapons that we have and we threaten to use.
Richard?
Yeah, just to reinforce what Asla is saying, it seems to me that this is just one more example, maybe a more dramatic one, of trying to focus the attention on others than the U.S. itself, and to say the threat is always from that enemy out there, and never to look at our own complicity in generating the threat and not responding in a constructive way to its existence. It seems to me if we're really looking at provocative initiatives to undermine stability, one should have been looking at Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons in the first place. That's one of the things that's created enormous incentives in the region to balance Israel's possession of nuclear weapons with the acquisition. Instead, we kept silent. We didn't say a word. We probably, I think it's demonstrated that we helped Israel acquire those weapons. So this tendency to always try to focus attention on what others do is, it seems to me, the worst way to respond to the real dangers and threats of nuclear weaponry.
Question is, would changing U.S. policies have a better effect on the irrational nature of how the law is applied in these issues? Doug?
Yeah, well, first of all, a simple answer to that question is, about the United States is that, just imagine if the President of the United States came forward and said, we're going to lead, my country's going to lead the world in nuclear disarmament through mutual verifiable methods. We're going to work in a cooperative fashion with all other states. I mean, it would be revolutionary. I mean, that's the answer to that question. On the question of terrorism and other states and where the center of the problem is, I have a homely kind of example I use, and I use it in academic settings all the time with my students. Look, nobody wants Iran or North Korea or terrorists or anybody else to get nuclear weapons. That's for sure. But these problems, let's take Iran, are flashpoints. They're flashpoints off of the volcano. The volcano is the existence of the 30,000 nuclear weapons by the nuclear weapon states. This is the centrality of the problem. We ill serve trying to make security, to enhance security in the world by constantly focusing on the periphery of the problem. And so that is why I made an appeal in my address to try to speak to publics, and this question came up earlier about how to reach out. I believe that the plutonium question, the technical questions are extremely important, but they're not understood by the public. But what the public does understand is that nuclear weapons are immoral and illegal, and it's that the centrality of that argument, the unitary nature of the argument, the intertwining nature of the argument on humanitarian grounds, that must be driven home by organizations like the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and everything else that we represent here. And I believe that if we can break through the lassitude, the passivity of thinking that characterizes the public and get a critical mass established, 25% of the public, that's enough, to put pressure on the political establishments that we could make progress. So I hope you will not interpret my argument as a simplistic one. Not at all. I'm all too well aware. I've been with Tom, I've been in negotiations up to my ears on the details of this in the diplomatic fora. But the more experience I got in this field, the more I worked in it, the more I realized that it is the essential story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the immorality, the illegality, the humanity, that is the only way we're going to turn public opinion and get the laws that we want. That's what we have to focus on.